It is my privilege and honor to introduce you to our very special guest speaker. Dave McMillin received his bachelor's degree in psychology from Greenville College, followed by a master's degree in clinical psychology from the University of Illinois at Springfield. He's authored several books on the Cayce readings, including a treatment of mental illness, and he's researched the Cayce readings as part of a multidisciplinary team through Meridian Institute. He's currently fascinated with computer 3D modeling, and he's been working on visual storytelling to explore the reincarnation history explored in the readings. He's done multimedia projects of Atlantis, the story of Rata in Egypt, the life and times of Jesus, and the reincarnation history of Greece and Rome. If I was asked to make a list of the 12 people in the world who knew and understood the Cayce readings best, David would be on that list. Join me in a warm welcome.
Okay, you can hear me okay, I assume? Technology's working great, and that little thing works good. So it's really inspiring to hear some of these presentations, and particularly the ones that have the multimedia and the web emphasis, because that's what I'm going to be talking about quite a bit today. And I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with the study group material. Yes? And how about the eGroups? Are you familiar with that? Most of you? Okay. But since this is being recorded and may end up on the internet, I am going to give a little background. So you bear with me on that. But mainly I'm going to talk about my experience with eGroups and Search for God. Of course, the first study group was formed in 1931 by friends and associates and family of Edgar Cayce, who wanted to take a deeper look at spirituality and sort of and grow in that way. And Edgar Cayce gave a series of readings, and the readings were used and applied by the study group members who wrote the books, A Search for God, which are still being used today in study groups all over the world. Of course, not everyone can attend a study group in certain places, so it's nice to have something online. That's where it ties in with the web. And there's been some of that over the years, as I understand, but this is a little bit new initiative here with the online mentored. It's actually a mentored study group. The first one we did was in 2012. It's web-based and digital with typical sort of bulletin board form software with the Search for God book text as the core with the supplemental resources, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about, and it is mentored. It's a fast-paced study with a lesson per week. Those of you who have been in study groups, imagine that, a lesson per week. We really keep moving along, and therefore we're able to cover 24 lessons in a year with a little bit of rest in between. And this is our fourth year, and there's a little bit of the schedule, kind of give you a sense of how that works out. So we have a little bit of rest period in between sessions. We have a wonderful blend of participants in terms of some very experienced with material and some just starting out, some new to Cayce, new to the Search for God, mostly from the USA, but we have international, so it's nice to get that spicy sort of perspective of people from around the world and how they look at this, and of course other spiritual traditions, which I do encourage people to come from wherever they are. The multimedia aspect of it is the videos, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and we have exercises and links to additional resources, which can sort of, one great thing about the web is you can link things together in a nonlinear way, so people can choose how they want to approach the material. So using the Search for God books as the core and other materials along with it, most of which I've created, many of it anyway. Now a little bit of the backstory on how this came about. Over a period of time, Kevin and I had worked on some multimedia projects, the past lives and your mission in life, online meditation. These are all multimedia online projects. And A Search for God was in line for that. We were in the planning stages, and Kevin gave me a copy of his book, which I really appreciated because not only was it well written, but I really liked the way he included information from all of the readings that were pertinent to each of the lessons. And that would just, I thought that was wonderful how it filled it out. And then, of course, I was familiar with Mark's books, which seemed to take a little deeper cut into some of the lessons, which I really appreciated, and particularly his exercises for application, which ends up being an important part of the Search for God mentored study group that I'm going to tell you about. And so, I don't know, things changed at the A.R.E. and our project kind of got put on the back burner for whatever reason, but I was so excited about it that I just went ahead and created the videos, because that was my role was to create the multimedia, and usually someone would do the voiceovers and the content aspect of it. So I did that, and the creative juices were kind of flowing, so I just went ahead and created exercises, sort of based on what Mark had done, web-based exercises, and created a lot of extra resources and put it on my website, because I have that skill set too, so it's almost free. You can put stuff on the internet if you have a hosting plan. So it just seemed like a reasonable thing to do, and I was so excited about it, I just went ahead and did it, with an emphasis on the universal and being inclusive, and also having a contemporary perspective, because some things have changed since the 1930s and early 40s when some of this material was created. And so I created, the exercises, and there you can see some of that. The video you click on YouTube, and it takes you there. So anybody in the world can have access to this at any time through my website. The videos for each of the lessons, some of them are pretty graphic. I don't pull any punches. I mean, this material will stand up to wherever you are in life, and whatever your experience, it will speak to it. I'm confident in that. And so I tried to approach it from that standpoint. And as I said, I found myself creating these supplemental resources for each lesson that you could click on and go and check out, and other resources as well, which I'll get into in terms of layers of the resources. It's all available on the website. And my concept, as I said, was to make it web-based with multimedia and a little deeper study of the lessons, sort of like Mark has done in some of his material, and Kevin. And I'll speak to that in terms of the beginner's level and the more advanced level that you can get into these lessons. The lessons themselves have different levels depending on where you're coming from. And of course, contemporary, and I'll give you examples of that as well. And it is what I'm going to talk about from here on out is the online mentored course, because at a certain point I'd created all of this stuff and put it on my website and made it available, and my concept was for traditional study groups, sort of like Mark and Kevin's books, something they can use in addition to the text, and have that available to them. And then I got an email that said, hey, we're going to be doing an eGroup online, which I didn't know too much about. I was just vaguely familiar that was coming about. And they asked me to mentor it. And so then it seemed like a reasonable thing to me. Well, I've got all this stuff I've created kind of for this purpose, an interesting synchronicity perhaps. Why not just take that material and use it? So I said yes to that, and we've been doing it now for 4 years with it. And one of the first things that I noticed, as I said, there's different levels to the material, and the people who sign up for this tend to have different experiences and different levels of understanding. And so I had created this material on my website as more of an advanced kind of study. And very quickly I realized, well, some of these people are like babes. And they actually encountered this in the first study group when they were creating the material, because they were asking about, should we use the book of Revelation in trying to explain the destiny of the body? And Edgar Cayce said, not necessarily. Now, he didn't rule it out. He just said, not necessarily. This is an advanced lesson for the learned, and we are beginning with babes. Now, he's talking about the members of the first study group, who some of them were beginners. And if you look at those readings and the questions they ask and so forth, they were beginners. And yet, some members of that group, you, Lynn, and Gladys and so forth, were very learned and very advanced. So it's an interesting sort of mix there that you find in the lessons that I'm going to talk about. And that's something that I had to sort of wrestle with too, because I had created something more advanced, and here are some of the people coming on and asking very basic questions about it. And so I had to sort of retool what I'd created to create some more of the exercises, say, at the beginner level, you see. And And I actually had a lesson there from the revelation that I had created on the sweet and bitter initiation from the revelation. And it is an advanced study, but it's something that if you're on the spiritual path, at somewhere along the line, you're probably going to have the sweet and bitter initiation. So it's good to know about it, even if conceptually you're not ready to assimilate all of it just yet. And I noticed that this was in for the opportunity lesson, a sweet and bitter opportunity, so to speak. And even though the beginners, even though they couldn't quite get their mind around it, they couldn't resist trying to understand it. That was so encouraging that they felt motivated to try to understand the more advanced material. Now, I had considered at a certain point maybe pulling some of this back off and not having some of the advanced exercises quite so much, and try to make it, because you only have a week to work on these lessons. And if you're trying to wrestle with something that's really complex, it's maybe not the best use of time. And it's still kind of an open question to me how to approach that. It's a work in progress, but so far I'm kind of inclined to do that. And one of the things I did was, even if you have an exercise like that, if it's a little more advanced, then you have layers of resources. So I went through some of my multimedia projects and pulled out video segments and put them on YouTube so that they could access that if they wanted to. So they could go as deep as they wanted in any of these exercises, even if they were more advanced. And so let me give you some examples right from some of the lessons, such as the first one on cooperation. One of the things that Edgar Cayce asked them to do was to identify their role, and he helped them out with that, pointing out you have the ability to do this and you have the ability to do that. And he had a dream in which some of the members of the group had healing abilities. So the question was asked, is this dream appropriate? And he said yes. And so a healing group was formed within the first study group. And of course, this went on to become the Glad Helpers. But he told them that there would be communications and interactions between the members of the group. And this is not only a promise, it's a threat. And so he's kind of setting them up here, kind of that sweet and bitter initiation thing here, you see. He's setting them up for it. And sure enough, there were differences of opinions, and personality and individuality were clashing. And what it mainly came down to was the Glad Helpers healing group were getting their own readings. And apparently some of the members of the main study group were getting jealous about that. And it reached a point where the healers were considering giving up getting those readings, just for the sake of having harmony with the rest of the study group. And so you have to ask yourself, in terms of cooperation, we're at the beginning here again of the process, is that cooperation? When you give up what you're doing, even though you may believe in it and so forth, just for the sake of harmony. And actually, in terms of the lesson, no, that's not cooperation. And thankfully, they figured that out. They solved this problem, and therefore we have the 281 series. Because that would have been a real shame to miss out on that, of course. And so I created a lesson on that. So it's real to life. This really happened. We're not, it's something that we all have to face at some point when clashes arise with other people. And how do you cooperate in a way that's consistent with the search for God? Now, in the second lesson, this was a little bit of a curve. This is where I talk about the different layers of the lessons, and sometimes they're more like the beginner material. Well, there's this sentence in that lesson on Know Thyself, in which each organ has its individual functions and desires, which are in themselves holy. And so I had a member of the group who was very experienced in study group for many, many years, and she asked me, well, what does that mean? Of course, she'd probably been through this, the lessons, and she knew about the lesson on desire, and so it was really a good question, but it's one of those advanced questions, you see. And so I put on my mentor's hat and dug into the readings, the 262 readings, and fairly easily I found the 262-8 where Edgar Cayce talked about that. And it was fairly complex, sort of like some of his physical readings. And then I noticed a citation for 262-10 where I could see that the original study group, they were confused about it too. In fact, they were so confused, they asked for more information, and Edgar Cayce gave one of those famously long paragraphs, with about 4 Bible verses embedded in it. And I love at the end there, I got a real chuckle out of this. To some, the explanation is worse than that first given. Edgar Cayce had a sense of humor when he was given the readings. Can you see that? He's kind of playful, ribbing them and poking fun at himself a little because he knew how dense this was and he knew that it was going to be problematic for them. And I also realized, well, I can't give that to the member of my eGroup because they're not going to get it either. Because it is very dense. Actually, I found it easier to go back and look at the original reading, which is more like a physical reading, and I had some experience with that. So I wrote her out a fairly extensive, about 3 to 4 pages worth of material, and I broke it down section by section to try to explain what all that meant. And that became a resource for that lesson, but I also put it under the desire lesson because it speaks to that as well. So it's a deeper layer of the material there. And I couldn't resist at the end of that in my comment to her, but like Cayce, the explanation I provide may be worse than the original phrase that tickled your mind in the first place. And whenever I can, I try to find those little nuggets like that and try to interact with them and try to keep the process light. And so I created an exercise for the fellowship lesson called Chuckling with God. And so people get to share a little bit of their humor in their spiritual search. And I think it's a great relief to them to realize that they can laugh about it and even about their failures and about whatever and the confusions and so forth. And they don't have to take it quite so seriously. And so that's one of my favorite exercises. And in looking through the readings themselves and creating some of this content, I look for those little bits of humor. So in the Day and Night lesson, in the Search for God 2, the question is asked, is it true that day and night are condensed or miniature copies of incarnations into the earth and into planetary or spiritual sojourns? They in turn being miniature copies of what took place in the beginning. Isn't that a learned question? That was Gladys, by the way. And so whenever I see Gladys in those readings, I perk up because what a mind. I mean, she'd sit through all those life readings and the creation story in the reading. So she knew there was something there. She sensed the connection, but she couldn't quite get her mind all the way around it. And then Edgar Cayce, very good if you understood just what all this means. And so, again, being a playful ribbing, and at the same time so precious that he's recognizing that and her good intent and her knowledge. Just one more example of what might be considered humor in the readings from the Spirit lesson. The question was asked, for what was the earth created? This has been explained so oft, if you have not gotten this, ye are dumb indeed. And of course, I use this in some of the talks I've given for examples of humor in the readings, and everybody chuckles, but this is a Search for God reading. I mean, this is the sacred, text and so forth. But it just kind of points out the humanity of the process, which I find so remarkable. Now, whether that was, playful ribbing, or maybe the process was wearing a little thin by that point, because that's the 24th lesson. And at times, Edgar Cayce would get after them, particularly when they asked questions and they hadn't applied what he had given before. And they would do that in the physical readings too. Apply that which has been given before seeking further information from these sources. So you get a little bit of that, and you get a little sense of how human it is, and that we're human and we're in the same process. Even today, this is a living work. Now, with regard to the creation story and multimedia, I became very aware of just how important that story was in many of the lessons, because I had created some animations for Edgar Cayce's cosmology, and I found myself going back and pulling out those animations time and time again in the lessons as I created videos for each of the lessons, and using those animations to tell the story, the creation story. Another one of the really important themes that you find in virtually every lesson is oneness. It's like a thread woven through the fabric of every lesson, beginning with cooperation, when you make your will one with God as the basis for cooperation, and then in know thyself, to be thyself and yet one with the whole. And right on through every lesson, oneness just keeps, it's right there. And of course, we have an entire lesson devoted to oneness. The Lord thy God is one, based on a Bible verse, as many of these lessons are. And then the question, again, this whole business of the layers of meaning within the lessons. Is this lesson about monotheism or polytheism, which it would have been a very relevant thing in the context of the Bible verse for the Hebrews back in their time, or is it more about unity and oneness, which is when you look at the text itself, when the study group put this material together, that's more the emphasis, because they weren't concerned about many gods, they believed in one God. But for one member of my study group, this was really important to sort this out, because she came from a culture in which polytheism was the norm. And for her to become a Christian and choose one God was a big deal. She had to, go against her family to do this. And so she wanted to know, well, what is the meaning of this lesson and how does this relate? And I just had to explain to her, this material works at multiple levels. And so for you, yes, it's about one God, just like the Bible verse. And for the original study group and most of the other people in the group, it's more about the unity and oneness aspect of it. But you don't have to choose between it. It's both. It's all. So it's inclusive. Has more of that universal quality to it, which I really like. And we find the same thing in the day and night lesson. Again, based on a Bible verse. And you can approach that lesson from a very dualistic perspective of good and bad, day and night, conscious and unconscious, oneness and separation. And at that level, it's fairly easy. And yet, when you really look at that Bible verse, which is the basis for the affirmation for that lesson, night showeth knowledge. In other words, night is not bad, it's essential. We can use it. And during the night we sleep and have dreams and use our unconscious mind, which Edgar Cayce called the mind of the soul in dreams. And even separation and oneness in terms of relationship and that big picture of the creation story, separation is essential for relationship. Without separation, there is no other to relate to. And so as souls, we were given will with the ability to have some sacred space to use our will. And of course, we got carried away, many of us, and went overboard and became very exaggerated and created real problems for ourselves. But basically, from the standpoint of that lesson, separation is part of what we need. So you can look at this in terms of a dualistic interpretation, or you can approach it more from the unity of complementary opposites, sort of like the yin and yang of the Tao, in which the oneness principle comes in again. Oneness of day and night, and the integration of conscious and unconscious at the mental level, and separate yet one in relationships, where you find over and over in these lessons to know yourself, to be yourself, and yet one with the whole, that is God. Now that's a pretty tough lesson, I've found. You can tell by how people respond in a week. When you go for the first 2 or 3 days and there's not too much going on, they're thinking about it, usually. They're thinking about it and chewing on it, and wrestling with it is how they're going to interpret the lesson, at their level. And there's no right or wrong to it. It's where are you at in your journey, and how can you use the information? And then the very next lesson is God's manifestation in the earth. The full title is God the Father and His manifestation in the earth. And one of the points in the text is, what is your concept of God? Now, fortunately, Edgar Cayce actually provided a little feedback on that question. He encouraged the members of the study group, not as Moses painted a God of wrath, not as David painted a God that would fight thine enemies, but as the Christ, the Father of love, of mercy, of justice. And the members of the eGroup, when they read that, I just get a sense that's how liberating that is to them in terms of their concept of God. They don't have to try to justify some of the stuff that happened in the Old Testament and say, well, God did it or whatever. It was just their concept of God. And we can have our concept of God. In fact, we all do have our concept of God. And we're encouraged to examine that. And that's one of the exercises for this lesson. And you find many different concepts of gods, even within the Cayce readings. And the loving parent aspect of Father, some people stumble a little bit over that, and they have a problem with God the Father and his manifestation in the earth in terms of gender and sex, and that's where the contemporary aspect of the lessons, we've changed a little bit and people think a little differently. So I leave it up to them. What is your concept of God in that respect? The ground of being, I am that I am. That's about as universal as you can get, certainly. And so they really enjoy working on this, and the energy just comes up very quickly, and lots of posts, and we can hardly keep up with it because they're so excited about examining what is their concept of God. And then, of course, there's an exercise on God's manifestation, because God's manifestation is based, to a large extent, on your concept of God. And if God is love, then you're going to manifest God in the world through love. Now, if you'll notice there at the bottom under resources, there's a link there, God within and without. And so that's that web-based resource link kind of concept. So you click on that, and it takes you to resources and articles, and they're all sort of based on this concept of God within and without that you find in many of these lessons. And I found this to be extremely helpful for people, to give them a conceptual framework of the lessons, God within, through meditation and prayer and mystical experiences, and God without in the world, in relationship to others and in relationship to all of creation. So it gives them a way of having this big picture and yet relate it to their own experience, which we try to do with each of those lessons. Now, I've talked about the principle of universality as one of the guiding principles for me in creating the content that I have and in mentoring the course. And I really love this excerpt from one of the work readings, in which we are encouraged to be all things to all men. For he that declares as a name in a name, save in the universality of the Father, limits the ability of the seeker. And goes on to encourage that concept of God, the I am that I am. So this ties in pretty directly with the concept of God, and it gives me sort of a way of thinking about all this material so I can relate to people no matter where they're coming from and use what they have to offer. And even to the extent I've created a couple exercises on Buddha, on compassion for the love lesson, and desire, because that's something that just Buddhism is renowned for. And Edgar Cayce was actually asked in those study group readings about Buddha and Muhammad as a prophet and whether or not to pursue that information. And he referred to them as stepping stones. Of course, he went on to say that, well, Christ, that'll take you all the way to where you need to go. But these are stepping stones. And so I found it best to try to just meet people where they are rather than expecting them to come to where I am. Try to find where they are and what's the next step for you on your journey. And whatever that is, that's what we go with. So we tend to be very open about it. And I enjoy in the multimedia aspect of creating the videos and stuff, some of this, and particularly Plato's Allegory of the cave for the faith lesson. Spirit is the life, mind is the builder, physical is the result. That's from Plato. And of course, Edgar Cayce had that past life at the time of Aristotle, and you find a lot of Socrates, Know Thyself, and Plato and Aristotle. It kind of forms the conceptual basis for much in the Cayce readings when you really look at it that way. And of course, Gertrude, Edgar's wife, had that past life as a daughter of Socrates. And so whenever I can bring that in, if people will relate to that, that's fine. And varieties of religious experience, if you have more of an intellectual approach to the material and you're thinking about in God's presence, well, there it is. I mean, William James, the father of modern psychology, but he really appreciated the mystic, and Edgar Cayce spoke of him in the readings, of course. And some of the other outstanding people in terms of consciousness and contemporary thinking and even neuroscience. I mean, as I say, this information speaks to wherever you're coming from. And so thy brain is not thy mind, it is that which is used by thy mind. So you don't have to, put your mind aside. When you look at this, you can use your mind, you can use neuroscience, you can use heredity and genetics, which are in part of some of these lessons in terms of karma and soul patterns. And I found this particular verse, this excerpt here, to be so helpful. I share it from time to time, depending on the consciousness of the person. When I sense that they may be sort of locked in and struggling with themselves, just to let them know, for what is truth today may be tomorrow only partially so to a developing soul. So it gives them the freedom to think outside the box that they put themselves in if they need to do that. And of course, as I said, we focus on application, as Edgar Cayce did in that first group with all the exercises. So I've given you just a little bit of background and some of the actual content and process from this online mentored Search for God group. And if you're interested in more, there's some links here and some contact information that you can follow through as you wish. Thank you very much.